This week we begin Unit 4, and this unit is going to be divided into three parts. First of all, we are going to look at the general sensory pathways. Then we are going to look at the special senses and their pathways. And finally, we will finish up our look at the different tracks by looking at motor pathways. General sensory pathways are going to be those pathways that are going to be involved in pain, temperature, touch, and proprioception. And so what I want to do first of all is just talk a little bit about these pathways in general, and then I want to look at the specific pathways. When we look at the general layout of general sensory pathways, these are usually going to be three neuron systems. You may have talked about this type of pathway in neurophys, but just to refresh our memory a little bit. The first order neuron is going to begin in the periphery as some sort of receptor. And it's going to be very, very important as we work through this that we always want to identify what that receptor is. Then we're going to see that the cell body of this first order neuron is going to be located in the dorsal root ganglion. And then we're going to come into the spinal cord where we will see the first order neuron end. Then we will have a second order neuron. The second order neuron is going to begin in the spinal cord. It is going to ascend in the named tracts that we see within the spinal cord and the brainstem, where the second order neuron will end in the thalamus. All sensory systems that we are going to look at are going to end in the thalamus before they go to the cerebrum, with the exception of olfaction. And then finally, we're going to have our third order neuron. The third order neuron is going to begin in the thalamus, and this neuron is going to ascend up into the cerebrum. Usually, we are going to be looking at area 312 of the cerebrum, but there will be, again, a few exceptions to that rule as we work through these general sensory pathways. So as I present the general sensory pathways, we'll be using this terminology of first order, second order, and third order neurons. The first series of pathways that we are going to be looking at are the pain and temperature pathways. The good news is that pain and temperature use the same pathway. It is just going to be based on primarily the receptor that is going to determine whether this is a pain pathway or a temperature pathway. When we look at these pathways, what I want you to keep in the back of your mind is that the nervous system needs to be able to sort out pain and temperature in four different modalities. First of all, the central nervous system has to be able to discern the intensity of that stimulus. In that, boiling water is going to feel different than lukewarm water. And so we always want to keep in mind that we have to be able to sort out the intensity. Excuse me. Secondly, we have to be able to figure out where the pain and temperature stimulus is coming from. You know, if you hurt your hand, but you move your foot, that really isn't going to do much good for you. So we have to be able to locate this stimulus. We also have to be able to discern the quality of that stimulus. Sometimes a nice warm feeling is going to be very, very gratifying, whereby a very hot feeling, not so much. And then finally, we have to have effects. You know, if you feel pain and you don't do anything about it, it's really not going to do any good for the protection of the body. So again, just kind of keep these four modalities, if you like, in your mind as we talk about the pathways associated with pain and temperature. Pain and temperature are going to use the same type of receptor, and these receptors are called free nerve endings. Free nerve endings are just that. They are the ends of nerves. These are the simplest of the different type of receptors. Depending on your source, you will find anywhere from 3 different types of free nerve endings upward. Since this is an anatomy class, again, I'm going to use the simplest of the systems. The first is going to be a mechanosensitive free nerve ending. These types of free nerve endings are going to use the 1A fibers, which you'll remember are the fastest conducting of our axons. And when we look at these are going to respond to any sort of change in that organ within the human body. You know, if we're talking about stretch, if we're talking about like pinching, you know, anything like that, that will be sensed by these mechanosensitive type of free nerve endings. Then we're going to have mechanothermal free nerve endings. These also are going to use our very, very fast conducting axons. These are the free nerve endings that respond to temperature. And what has been shown is that these respond best to changes in temperature, not a static state. And then finally, we have polymodal free nerve endings. Polymodal free nerve endings will respond to any sort of pain or temperature stimulus. But the critical factor here is that these are going to use the type 3 axons, which are going to be the lightly myelinated, slow conducting neurons within our central nervous system. Well, what I'm going to do now is I want to focus primarily on pain. And then in just a moment, I'll correlate pain and then temperature together. When we look at pain, pain is basically the body's protection against a noxious stimulus. In other words, this is going to be the body's protection about anything that could be harmful. And as such, then we can allow the body to have effects to get away from that noxious stimulus. There are 2 different types of pain. And again, if you think about it, you know this already. There's what is called first pain. First pain occurs right after an injury. Again, if you think about it, you know, as an example, think about taking a pin and just pricking the palm of your hand. You're first going to experience a sharp, intense, very well localized stimulus. And that's because the first pain is going to be using the 1A fibers. In other words, we're going to get a very, very rapid response. But then over time, we are going to see that all of a sudden we get this second pain that persists after the first pain goes away. This is usually a dull, achy, prolonged, very diffuse pain. In other words, if you ask the patient, you know, where does it hurt? They give you this big, broad type of description. And that's because we are going to be using the type 3 nerve fibers. But also, we're going to see that these 2 different types of pain are hooked up slightly different. when we look at the pathway associated with this pain. Pain and temperature is going to be going through a system called the anterior lateral system. And the anterior lateral system is going to be made up of 3 tracts. The first tract is the spinal thalamic tract. And this is for the conscious perception of pain and temperature. When we say that we are dealing with conscious perception, what that means is that we are going to go to the cerebrum, because that is the only way that we can consciously perceive something. Then also in this system, we're going to have the spinal tectal tract. And we're going to talk about the spinal tectal tract when we get to pain modulation. We know that the human can control pain to a slight degree, and this is the pathway that will do it. And then finally, in this system, we're going to have the spinal reticular tract. The spinal reticular tract is going to be for autonomic nervous system and reflex responses to pain. And again, you know this because you have been in pain before and you've noticed that, your respiratory rate increases, your heart rate, your blood pressure. All of these autonomic nervous system controlled functions of the body are going to change. So as we look at the pathway, I'm going to look at these 3 pathways within the anterior lateral system. Finally then, whatever we say about the type 3 pain system, that is going to be the exact same pathway that's going to control the warmth or the warm sensation. And again, it's based on the receptor that is stimulated. When we talk about 1A pain, that is going to be for cold. And so, again, just in the back of your mind, you want to remember these different systems.